I guess we can start then. And we have a lot to discuss today, as usual. So let's get on to it. And for our
All
topic,
right.
the expert prognosis for the planet says we're on for a gas. Why is it? Because of the rapid loss of biodiversity. And the question is anyone paying attention or doing something about it? For our technology story, the question, maybe you have thoughts. Should social media take sides? Should they try to enforce the truth? On materials, we have another two-dimensional and transistor story with tiny transistors that will let chips get smaller and smaller and therefore much more effective. In terms of flight, it's a tough time for the aviation industry. As airlines hunker down, Airbus orders plunge 65%, and Boeing is probably down about 80%. And now, onto the environment. Apparently, the Earth will reach the temperature tipping point in the next 20 to 30 years. Can we act urgently to deal with that? And in biology, who would have thought it? Apparently, bacteria can tell the time. And for us, apparently, according to a UK survey, says working at home will quintuple by 2025. That's a 500% increase in just 4 years. That's staggering. Who's left at the office? And for our last story on health, apparently scientists have found an antibody that blocks dengue virus. So when can we get that at Lakeside? So that's what we'll talk about today. And so now, Richard, what's the top story that our future so costly because of the lack of biodiversity? Richard, we can't hear you.
We can't hear you.
Oops.
Oops, yeah, there you go.
Okay, thank you. If you want bad news, and some people seem to love bad news, this is one of two bad news stories today. And maybe we can take a poll at the end, which is the worst bad news for the day. And it turns out that in this time we're in, there is a loss of biodiversity and accelerating climate change, which, when you couple them together with ignorance and inaction, are threatening the survival of all species on this planet. And the researchers say that world leaders need a cold shower regarding the state of our environment and a plan to act to avoid a ghastly future. And I'm going to read some quotes from the researchers. This is Corey Bradshaw of Flinders University in Australia. He says, quote, "Humanity is causing a rapid loss of biodiversity, and with it, Earth's ability to support complex life. But the mainstream is having difficulty grasping the magnitude of this loss." In fact, the scale of the threats to the biosphere and all its life form is so great that it's difficult to grasp even for well-informed experts. And he concludes by saying the problem is compounded by ignorance and short-term interests with the pursuit of wealth and political interests stymieing the action that is crucial for survival. So just to go on in that theme, Paul Ehrlich, we've all heard of Paul Ehrlich. He says humanity is running an ecological Ponzi scheme in which societies robs nature and future generations to pay for short-term economic enhancements today. And back to the Aussie professor, he concludes saying, without fully appreciating and broadcasting the scale of the problem and the enormity of the solutions required, society will fail to achieve even modest sustainability goals, and catastrophe will surely follow. So that's what we got to start off with.
Okay, well, I don't know whether to say thank you for that, Richard, or not.
Not.
Any comments?
Well, if only we could start reducing the population and eventually end up with half what we've got now, it solves everything. And actually, I mean, it was probably easier than the alternatives.
Oh, you think the COVID virus isn't bad enough?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, there's another problem, and that is the forest in Brazil, in Mato Grosso. They're cutting it down at a very rapid pace. That affects biodiversity, and also the trees are supposed to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So that accelerates the problem
Yes.
we're talking about.
Yes, we'll talk about that a little later.
Any other comments?
I think the
just
real,
that-
go ahead.
Go ahead, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to agree with Cleve. I think the population is the elephant in the room that people refuse to talk about because it's politically incorrect. But there's Mother Nature trying to correct the balance, and we're interfering with her at every opportunity.
You'd think Paul Ehrlich knew about that, since he's the guy who wrote the population bomb that started a lot of this thinking, and it seemed like now that's ancient history, that book.
Well, and Paul Ehrlich is 88 years old now, and he's toned down his Malthusian apocalypse, probably because of political correctness and all these other things. So,
Uh-huh.
but yeah.
I was going to say that I think the real, well, I agree with you. The real problem is humans, and the problem really is the inability of the human mind to understand the scope of the problem. You know, we just cannot conceive of it. We can't fathom that much outside of ourselves, that much change. And I don't know how somebody gets around that and becomes a real apostle.
Talking about education and technology, our next question is probably fact. And the question is, should social media take sides? Should they enforce the truth? What do you think about that?
Well, now this expression, the view from nowhere This is an idea that was in the general media, and the idea is basically uh, political agnosticism. And this idea in the journalism leads to something that we all love. It's called both sides reporting, where instead of offering any critical viewpoints, they get extremists from opposite sides talking about it, and now we're fair and balanced. And this kind of journalism, for example, about the climate debate, has given industry shills an equal online airtime along side client scientists. So this both siderism hasn't been very effective. And this idea has infected social networks, maybe Facebook the most of all. And Facebook defends their platform as a platform for all ideas. And the they've recently, however, deplatformed. That's a new word, by the way, deplatformed Donald Trump. And this marks a floating up on the shore. Somebody's talking, and if they could turn your microphone off or something, then you can. Okay. Anyway, the deplatforming of Donald Trump is a departure from this view from nowhere attitude. And Facebook also hired a guy, Roy Austin, who's a civil rights attorney who worked in the Obama administration, and they've given him the position vice president of civil rights. So I'm not sure what he's doing on Facebook, but he's got a big job anyway. And the head of Instagram says, and this is a quote, "We're not neutral. No platform is neutral. We all have values, and those values influence the decisions we make. We try and be apolitical, but that's increasingly difficult, particularly in the US." And so now, uh, of course, the platform for all ideas has been a part of Facebook's self-conception. And from a business viewpoint, that makes perfect sense for two reasons. The first reason is human judgment is expensive. And these internet companies like not to have to hire people. And the second part, which I think is the key part actually, is taking a moral stand can alienate people who disagree with that stand. So it's going to lose them eyeballs, and it's race for eyeballs, because unless they can get people watching it, they can't sell all their advertising. And so they embrace what they say is free speech, which means they can get as many eyeballs as they can get. And again, from a societal standpoint, this has been costly. And the ideas that flourish in this kind of environment are the ones that are most likely to induce clicks. So, what they mainly are presenting are simple answers to complex problems. And that ends up making these platforms, a platform for all ideas implies a platform with no standard. And that kind of viewpoint really gave us first Donald Trump as president, QAnon, and last week's violent insurrection in the US Capitol. And some people are saying, quote, this feels like a moment that, depending on the fallout, might release platforms from needing to defend themselves as neutral. But in the long term, the platforms will only let go of this claim of neutrality when they can settle on a new, equally defensible principle. And some have suggested fairness as a principle for the social media. Another has suggested accountability, but neither of those ideas is taken off. I guess the idea of fairness and accountability, they're afraid might cost them eyeballs. So they there are some people that are saying this deplatforming of Trump and all the things with it are the signs of these internet platforms starting to act with social responsibility. I, being from Silicon Valley, suspect that idea is not true. They're motivated for other things besides the social good.
So that's Richard's comments. What do you all think?
In terms of fairness, the Reagan administration, the FCC under the Reagan administration in 1987 rescinded the fairness doctrine.
And that's
So
when we have
you can
Fox
go all the way
News.
back to then.
Yes, yes.
And it's, you know, I don't believe, I mean, certainly Reagan deregulated practically anything he could, for better or worse. I'll leave that to everybody else's opinion. But we did have something in the FCC called the Fairness Doctrine. How in the world that was enforced with regard to the economic need for eyeballs is another question altogether. But if you're going to posit that fairness should be the determination for how things are viewed, it's good to remember that until 1987, that was a thought.
And the Reagan's move on the fairness doctrine is what brought us Fox News.
Exactly.
Yes.
One thing
Exactly.
I have not seen from the various plans of the Democrats and progressives is a reinstatement of the Fairness Act. And that's been one of the things that's on my own personal list.
Yeah, yeah. And I don't know if any of you read Heather Cox Richardson, but she does a podcast and she has something called Letter from an American. And she has been really good at doing a timeline that everybody can understand. I mean, I can understand it, so everybody can understand it. That kind of tells us how we got to this point. And I recommend it highly if you don't already. There's a free subscription and a paid subscription. The difference with the paid subscription is you can put in your comments. So, I mean, I'm perfectly happy with my free subscription.
And so who was that?
Sorry.
Who is that you mentioned?
Heather Cox Richardson. She is a historian, a professor at Boston College. She used to be a professor at MIT. And believe it or not, she's a Republican.
Okay.
And she says she is an Abraham Lincoln Republican, but she is a Republican.
She also has a daily
Podcast.
letter or whatever on Facebook just about every day.
Oh,
Very interesting
okay.
to read it.
Now, one of the things I like about what we do here is we exchange information, and to hear about people like this is one of the services that we do for each other. So thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. Other comments?
I was pretty concerned when I heard that, well, initially I wasn't, but as we stopped hearing from Trump, first of all, that deplatforming, I think, has helped my blood pressure.
That's
I've
good.
noticed.
They also
This is
say
recent.
that the people who measure truth on the internet says that since Trump was deplatformed, the amount of lies on the total internet have gone down by 73%.
Whoa, whoa. Yeah, but also, of course, I agree with their deplatforming, but if I were on the other side, oh my, I would be furious.
Yes.
And I think I also read a few articles in which the people in some of the leaders in Europe or the EU are looking at this saying, hey, wait a minute, we better start looking at this and make sure, all of a sudden the wrong people getting put in charge, and it really could be very dangerous.
And in Mexico, AMLO is also opposed to the Trump's deplatforming. So part of the question here is if these platforms are going to start enforcing some kind of moral or intellectual standards, we have the regular question of whose standards.
Yeah.
And I'm sure instead of debating that in their boardroom, they're still talking about how many views they got this week.
And there's an element too that the media have always been one-sided, right from the first newspapers. They've
Right.
always promoted their own interests.
Mhm.
And the public have been always lagged the media in terms of being suspicious of the information or the advertisers' claims and so on. And in our own case, when CNN first started, we thought they were objective and honest, but that's all recognized now as just the leftist nonsense. So I don't know. I think we just have to remain vigilant.
There's a way to get around that in a way, and that is reading publications from different sources, Washington Post, New York Times, The Guardian from the UK. If you read all of those, you sort of get at least an average opinion on things.
But you're still not reading all the different sources. You're not talking about reading a crazy right-wing journal to get a balanced opinion. You're just reading those liberal papers, Your Highness.
But this also, I mean, the fact of reading different papers, that's something that one person can do individually, and they can go to, really different ones if they want to. That's newspapers or newspapers online, whatever. But the social media platforms have another tool in their arsenal besides simply letting somebody on or kicking them off. They are the ones that channel the news to individuals. And until they address their algorithms that show you only what they think you want to see based upon past performance, we're not going to get anywhere in terms of what truths are really being shown on various platforms.
And in the case of Facebook, Facebook's tendency is to believe the thing that is true is the thing that gets the most clicks.
Yeah.
And there is the thing about confirmation bias.
Yes.
All of us as consumers of information only believe what we already believe. And Facebook recognizes that and, like you say, channels the information to you that you already believe because that will sell them more advertising.
Right. Yep.
Okay, then if we move along, Richard is quite entranced with 2D materials, transistor graphene, and now here's another one. You
Now,
get tiny transistors that will let chips get smaller and smaller. What's that about?
well, let me first defend myself. I'm so entranced by this because I spent a decade as a in the semiconductor industry, actually a decade and a half at two different times, and I saw what was happening that was creating all this technology that went out into the world. And I saw a driving force was for the semiconductor companies to what they would say is improve their yields. And the yields are how many good devices they get for every wafer that they process through. They increase their yields by using bigger wafers is one of the ways, but the biggest way is they increase their yields by pushing what they call feature size. And the smaller that you can make things like transistors, then the more you can get on a chip. And they've run to the limit of this about 3 years ago because they can't get anything smaller with the semiconductor technology because they start getting so small that they start having quantum effects instead of what we think of as normal electric behavior. So the push within the technologists is how do we continue to make things smaller, and these 2D materials, graphene being the most well-known one, have attracted a lot of interest in terms of making things smaller, because certainly in terms of thickness, something that's one atom thick is as thin as you can get. And so one of the problems they have had in terms of making semiconductor devices smaller is something that is called short channel effects that limit the length of the gate, which is one of the parts of the transistors. It limits the length of it. There's a kind of transistor, though, called a field effect transistor, or FET, that is not affected by this short channel problem. And so they've been experimenting with FETs with 2D semiconductors, and they have now been able to make them. And besides being smaller, it turns out these 2D FETs have improved performance. So they're at the same time smaller and better than all the existing silicon-based counterpoints. So being able to make small transistors, the transistor is the basic element of any semiconductor device. And now that we can make tiny 2D transistors, what we will start to see next is actual functioning chips that are made with this 2D material that are smaller and more efficient and generate less heat than anything the world has ever seen before. That's all, Fred.
So, any comments?
Well, one of the things was they mentioned this 300 millimeter dimension.
It's got to be micrometers, but it
No,
says
it's
300
30
mm.
centimeters.
Yeah, 30 centimeters is
Do you think that?
enormous.
Well, is that the diameter of the silicon disk in the factory, or is that something else?
I'm
Do you
not.
think that's micrometers? If it was,
I couldn't figure out what that was because it doesn't make any sense with regard to the rest of the article. And to understand what that means, I would actually have to know something. We depend on you for that, Andrew.
Well, I'm not at all electronic, so I
Well,
don't
it might be
understand.
300 millimeters is about the, except it would be 300 centimeters. I was going to say 300 millimeters is about the size of current wafers, but that's 12 inches and that's 300 centimeters.
Too big.
Too big. So anyway, I don't know
Yeah.
what that is. And so in my own mind, I translated it to some other tiny unit of measure. So I don't know.
Comments?
And usually, by the way, on most of these things that I have that we talk about that I list under materials are things that are really on the forefront of the scientific and technical development, and they are hard for most people to understand, even engineers sometimes. And so we have very few comments about what I present as materials because it's way off the scale.
Well, Richard, good repartee. So, other comments? If not, we'll move on to space and flights. And apparently, the aviation industry is in enormous problems. With the COVID and the hunkering down, Airbus orders plunge 65%. Boeing's profits are down about 80%. So, what's going on?
Well, it turns out that the problem comes from the air flight and COVID. Worldwide, the industry, the aviation industry, their revenue is down by almost 2/3. So it turns out when the revenue is down, the airline's operating costs are measured in terms of the billions of dollars per day. And so it's expensive to run an airline. And it's not only the fuel costs are a variable expense because if you're not flying, you're not buying fuel, but all those stupid aircraft that are just sitting on the runway are a capital expense and you don't own any of them. You're paying for your loan for those airplanes. And so it costs you money whether they fly or not. And so to react to this, one of the things that Airbus has done already is they've lowered their production at their factory by 40%. But to give you an idea how bad their problem is, Airbus last year had 268 net new orders for the year. And in the year, they shipped 566 aircraft out to the airlines. So their order rate is about half of their shipment rate. And this is just absolute disaster for any business. And I still personally don't know how in the heck all of these companies are continuing to survive and stay in business. And it might be we see in the next few months that a bunch of them can't stay in business because no revenue means no business.
Yeah, actually, the airlines have been subsidized a lot by the taxpayer in the last year or so.
Yes.
Very large amounts of the $1 trillion aid packages and all, quite a large chunk of that goes to the airlines.
Yes.
Just to keep the critical infrastructure going.
Now, comparing Boeing with Airbus, isn't Boeing doing even worse than Airbus?
Yes, and they deserve it.
All right.
You know, the quick story about Boeing is a number of years ago, Boeing made an acquisition of a military company. I can't remember the name of it. McDonnell Douglas or something like that. And finally, this company they acquired was run by numbers guys, and Boeing was run by engineers. And though they acquired this other company, the other company's management acquired Boeing. They took over, and instead of engineers running Boeing, making decisions on a technical basis, the number guys were running Boeing, making decisions based on profitability instead of safety. And that led to the disasters of the Boeing aircraft that had a new feature, and its new feature was it crashed. And they didn't train the pilots how to not make it crash. And that kind of gave their business a crash.
And in Canada, we're now starting to use Boeing once again with both WestJet and Air Canada.
Uh-huh. I bet Boeing is making a deal to get those aircraft. Boeing has hundreds of aircraft sitting on their runways waiting for some poor sucker who wants to buy them.
Any other comments?
Yeah, well, everything to do with the economic impact of COVID, I would like to see some clever economists kind of do a comparison with the economic impact of the Second World War, because growing up in post-war Britain, I remember food rationing. I remember when you went to the grocers and you used to take these little coupons out of your ration box and things like that. And that went on for 7 or 8 years after the Second World War. The other impact that I remember was there was a massive housing shortage because no houses got built during the war. And so there was, that probably took 10, 15 years to rectify. So I wonder what food shortage is, and I'd like to see some economic forecasting.
Maybe we should move on to environment. And here's the second of the stories that Richard thought could be extremely worrisome. Apparently, in the next 20 to 30 years, the Earth will reach a temperature tipping point. And the question is, can we do something about it, and urgently so? Richard, what's that?
Well, this is kind of another component of the lead story. And what a team of international scientists have found is that Earth's ability to presently, the stuff growing on Earth absorb about a third of the human-based carbon emissions. And it looks like that in 20 or 30 years, they're talking about a tipping point, and that tipping point is that plants could, this emissions that the plants absorb could be reduced by half then in 20 or 30 years. And the reason for that is the team has identified a critical temperature tipping point beyond which plants' ability to capture and store carbon decreases as temperature continues to rise. And they have found then they detected a temperature threshold beyond which plants' carbon uptake slows and their carbon release accelerates. And so they're saying in this particular tipping point is the point at which all of the plants and vegetation on the planet, instead of being a net absorber of carbon, are a net carbon source. And so they start putting carbon into the atmosphere instead of taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And I have to say about this, oh my God, uh, that's not what we need. And so for the time for urgent action, this is actually the moment, and we need to have urgent action. And the urgent action, for example, that the Bidens are talking about, and that's a part of the progressives' Green New Deals and stuff like that, actually is not urgent enough. And so we now not only know all of this stuff is bad, but now we have a timeline in which if we don't do something by then, all of the future generations are impacted, is the most polite way I know how to say it.
Any comments?
It's hard to be optimistic in the current scenario.
Yeah.
The only optimism, VJ, is that we won't be around 30 years from now to deal with it.
But those of us thinking about our grandchildren, then it kind of is worrying. Unless,
Yeah.
of course, Clive has his way and half of them die.
Well, there's a self-correcting element to it, all right.
The
Well,
only problem, Andrew, is that with all the breakthroughs in technology, they may keep us alive.
I hope so. I hope so. One of the things about technology is with these new technologies, they have nonlinear adoption curves. That for the civilian, that means that they can be adopted really fast. If you look at what happens in the next decade with electric vehicles versus internal combustion engines, you're going to see one of those exponential growth curves in action. And unfortunately, eliminating all the internal combustion engines on the planet is not enough.
Just a comment on electric vehicles. I have a Nissan Leaf, which is totally electric, and they actually charge me more for the license because they tell me by not using gas and paying taxes on the gas.
Okay, that's right. I hadn't thought about that.
Talking about plants.
Just the comment on the electrical vehicles. He's not paying his fair share of the roads and the asphalt by driving an electric.
That's right. That's right.
Now, in terms of biology, we don't only have plants, we also have bacteria. And who'd have thought it? Apparently, this bacteria, they can tell the time. What's that about?
Well, it turns out that these tiny bacteria actually represent 12% of the biomass of the planet, which is a lot bigger number than I had imagined before I read this, because you think about bacteria, they're really small, right? But for them to be 12% of the biomass means there must be a lot of them. And it turns out that for something that there's so many of, there's a lot that we don't know about bacteria, a lot. And one of the things is how they behave every day. Previously, studies have shown there's a there are some bacteria that are photosynthetic. That is, they take the light and metabolize it and turn it into energy, just like plants do. And they found that these photosynthetic bacteria do have biological clocks and operate on a circadian rhythm. But they did not know about non-photosynthetic bacteria. And so this international team then figured out a way to check the circadian rhythm of bacteria, and they ended up giving them an enzyme that produces bioluminescence, and they use that to monitor their activity level on a couple of genes. And what they found was, with careful tests using uh, light cycles, for example, that are 12 hours on and 12 hours off to replicate the circadian cycle, they found the patterns adjusted to the light and dark cycle. And the pattern was so strong within the bacteria that the cycle was still observed in total darkness. Once they put them on the clock, if they took them off the solar clock, their internal clock kept going. So that's pretty powerful evidence. Then further, to check things out, they also did variations of temperature, and they found that the bacteria cycle again was based on light and darkness, not upon rising and falling temperatures. So there, uh, this is a quote from one of the guys, one of the women, Martha Murrow, Merrow, who's a professor in Germany. And she says, quote, "We found for the first time that non-photosynthetic bacteria can tell the time."
Any thoughts?
Well, I don't know whether I'm not surprised that anything has circadian rhythms, because we've had the whole world has been had circadian rhythms from the beginning of time. So anything at all that's developed, even a bacteria, has to be aware of that.
Though bacteria doesn't have many eyes, I don't think. But, part of the interest in this, beyond just that, wow, I didn't know that, the interest is, for example, are bacteria more infectious at one time or another? Or is there a time of day that is best to apply antibacterial medicines? Are two of the kind of issues that are involved. And so it's not a trivial issue.
No.
Actually, the CRISPR technology was developed because the two women scientists who discovered CRISPR found that the bacteria's genome was being altered by viruses. And that's
Yes.
what I'm curious to find out, why is a virus invading a bacteria and changing its genome? And
Yes.
that led to the invention of CRISPR. It's pretty amazing.
Yes.
Well, then moving along, apparently we're going to have a 500% increase in 4 years of people working at home. Who's left at the office? Any comments about this issue? Richard.
Well, this is another case of the long-term changes that are coming through this pandemic. The scope of this was really just in Britain, and what they see is intensifying a trend that started during the pandemic. And they interviewed nearly 100 financial directors in different companies in Britain's biggest companies. And it they found that the global health crisis had, quote, triggered fundamental and lasting changes in business. And what they found is that these different sectors in business had been able to maintain a high degree of effectiveness while they're operating from home. And they expect, even though the companies expect growth to continue or to start again in 2021, they're going to have more workers working at home. And again, the expectation of a 500% increase in just 4 years is, to me, it just staggers my imagination. I also, with this, one of the things I wonder about is what's going to happen to the commercial real estate business, the people who are renting offices out. The person working at home doesn't need an office.
Thoughts?
It's
Well,
nothing but good. I mean, I remember when I was programming and I was off sick, and I could do more work at home without supervision than I could in the office. And who wants to waste 2 hours of every working day just sitting in traffic, which is what commuters are doing? And
Yes.
who cares if a few kind of billionaire property companies lose the shirt on downtown skyscrapers? I mean, the rest of us are going to be a hell of a lot better off, you know.
That's
Other
right.
thoughts?
You know, this has also all kinds of ramifications, like the tax base, like the cities that have these buildings get property taxes and income taxes
Yes.
and all from people working there. Now, all of a sudden, all that's going to evaporate. So
Yes.
there's all kinds of ramifications.
The
One
other
of them,
aspect-
go ahead, please.
I'm sorry. The other aspect is it might affect the auto industry because less people are going to be commuting, but on the positive side, also less carbon emission into the atmosphere.
Good.
Yeah.
I think that's a good point. Also in California already, one of the things that they've discovered is there are communities that are called gateway communities, and these are the gateways to national parks and recreation areas and stuff like that. And in these communities already, there has been a substantial change because all of these out-of-towners with more money than people in the city have come in and bought up the property and are living now in this wonderful place and commuting by the internet. And it's really messing up these gateway communities and the societies there and the political power and who has money and who knows how that's going to work out.
Yeah.
Governments presumably will get less revenue from folks like us because we'll want to have deductions for where we work at home.
That's right.
Mm.
You
Right.
know, if we
There, I
had a-
think, yeah, there are even certain companies all set up. And I think they're also, well, I know from in Manhattan, there are certain companies, even though you don't want to go to the office, if you want to get out of your house, they'll rent you an office.
Right. Yes. Yes.
And I also Manhattan, I'm also concerned about, I mean, even the place is so empty. I mean, the lunches and the, you know, all the activity around working, people working there, you know, and it's,
Yeah.
Now, the one I worked, spent the last 15 years as a consultant working out of an office in my garage. And I think that kind of qualifies me as a little background here. And one of the things that I found that I really missed is in working, I feel like I got about half of the work done, accomplished in what I call hallway encounters. You know, where you're walking around and you see somebody in the hallway that you needed to interact with and coordinate and work some stuff out. And those were good times, because if you meet somebody in the hallway, they're going to some place, they have limited time. You just get right to it and you deal with what you need to deal with, and then you keep walking. And once I was working out of my garage, I didn't have these hallway meetings anymore.
Right.
I'll second that. I've spent by far the largest part of my working life working from home, and in a variety of, I mean, for a variety of companies and as an independent. And everybody thinks it sounds wonderful, and there are some wonderful aspects to it, but there are an awful lot of downsides to
Right.
it too. I don't believe for a minute that it's going to be 500% in 4 years or whatever the number was. I think we're headed more for a hybrid model. I think that more people, I mean, certainly people do want to work from home sometimes, but they don't want to work from home all of the time.
Mm.
And they don't want to work from home for their whole career. But there are some real trade-offs there. So I think that I mean, first of all, management of companies is going to have to become much more interested in the possibilities and much more permissive about doing it, but also plan for it more. And I just think that it's not going to be as easy as it sounds. And I don't think that the consequences to the social environment are going to be as drastic as we're talking about. But we'll work into something that is a little bit different and that will allow people or encourage people to come in sometime, so that there is some of that walking in the hall stuff. Yeah.
Now, my son is a high-powered IT guy at Nike in Portland, and what his technical job, he's doing now what was the job of 5 people, and he's doing it from a room in his house underneath a stairway, and he uh, what he has found in that environment, so he's been doing this for several years, and what he found in that environment, there's a part of working still that is collaborative, and there's a part of your influence with other people that comes from ongoing interaction with them. So except for this time with COVID, he would have some time, maybe a couple of days a month or something like this, where he would go into the office deliberately so he would be visible and interacting with the other people there. So
maybe we should move on to our last story, but might be significant in terms of those of us at Lakeside. Apparently, there's an antibiotic that blocks dengue. I don't know how many of you know people who've had dengue, but it can be really, really rough. Any comments on that, Richard?
now, one of the things about dengue is there are, of course, no vaccines for dengue virus, and there are no effective treatments. So no vaccines, no treatments makes it particularly dangerous. And then to make it worse, there are 4 different strains of dengue, at least presently, and they're different enough that building up antibodies against one strain actually can make you more susceptible to being infected by one of the other strains. So this building up the related antibodies doesn't help. And it makes people more vulnerable to infection through dengue. And so dengue, the dengue virus uses a particular protein called non-structured protein, or they call it NS1, that latches onto the cell and enables the infection. And so what the research found is an antibody called 2B7, which physically blocks the NS1 protein, preventing it from attaching to the cell, which prevents the infection from happening. And most important is this antibody is effective against all of the 4 strains of the dengue virus. So it's a universal antibody. So far, it's just been tested on mice. They're going to have to use human treatments, but we have, looking forward, we have an antibody that is now shown to be effective in just stopping the dengue virus in its tracks.
Any comments?
Well, I have 2 quick comments. One is, I think this mRNA vaccine that's been developed for COVID, I think that technology is going to be increasingly used for other vaccines.
Yes.
And it can be developed very rapidly. So that's a glimmer of hope. The other thing is that they're also attacking mosquito carrier diseases like dengue by genetically modifying mosquitoes that go and mate with the dengue
Sure.
mosquito and make it sterile. And so the production of the dengue mosquitoes taper off.
That's the idea. So far, I haven't really heard that idea has been effective anywhere, because you have to do it on a pretty large scale. But I've had friends who've had dengue, and it was a terrible infection.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I guess, Richard, it's probably time for us to sign off, but thank you so much for this. And thank you to everybody for participating, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Some
Richard.
of us
Thank you,
might-
Thanks, everybody.
Very good. Good session again, guys.
Bye, Jenny.
Thank you.